is Matt Cook. I'm the director of the Center for Healthy Churches. I'd like to welcome you this morning to the Changing Church webinar. This webinar is designed to equip ministers and congregations to ask and answer a lot of wonderful, thought-provoking questions on how we do church in this very adaptive moment in which we find ourselves. In just a moment, I'm going to introduce our two panelists. Is that what we call? I don't know if it's fair to call Deborah and Jim panelists, but we'll use the term for the moment. Before I do, I want to thank all the organizations that helped make this webinar a reality. We are very grateful for the good work of the Presbyterian Foundation, for Truett Seminary and the Truett Church Network, for Gardner Webb Divinity School, for Baptist News Global, for the Lake Institute for Faith and Giving, and for the good work of PneuMatrix, whose co-principals, Jim Kitchens and Deborah Wright, are both on with us this morning and are going to lead our discussion. So with that, let me start by handing off the baton to the two of you. Good morning.
Good morning. Thank you. Yeah, and Matt, you used the right word, conversation. I would like for this to be a conversation with all of us. I mean, Deborah and I are going to talk with each other. That's kind of how we're doing this thing today. But we want you to jump in anytime you want to join the conversation or you have a question. And Matt and Jeannie are going to kind of help watch the chat to see when you put something up. So please make this an all-way conversation once we get into it. This whole series is addressing sort of how do we begin to take next steps when we don't know what we're headed for. Susan Beaumont just put up a post a couple of days ago saying, hey, folks, we're not at the new normal yet. We're still in this liminal period and are going to be for a while. But we all know we can't wait until we figure out what that new normal is before we begin to do some things differently. So all of our webinars in this series are about kind of how do we think about taking some new steps, even though they may not be the final answer about who we need to be and what we need to do. Today, we're going to talk about a concept that comes out of Silicon Valley called rapid fail R&D. And I'm going to ask Deborah to kind of talk about how they dreamed up this idea in Silicon Valley and some of her early work with Google that came out of this issue. So Deborah, where did rapid fail R&D come from? What does it mean?
Thank you. Well, I ran into it as it was emerging, 20, 30 years ago when I started working kind of accidentally as a corporate chaplain. I was asked to go in and by a trustee from the seminary that I went to go in and work with some small startups. And this was a crazy time in Silicon Valley. Sort of money was getting thrown at anything that anybody wanted to try. That has changed. But it is still true that if you drive where I live, which is Sausalito, I live in the town that is just on the other side of the Golden Gate Bridge from San Francisco. If I get in my car and drive from here to, say, Palo Alto, I will drive literally by the logos on high rises or office parks of practically every app that you have on your telephone. Most of them were developed in Silicon Valley. The old model that we had of sort of the stereotype was of young 20-something guys huddled over their laptops drinking Red Bull for 48 hours straight, trying to come up with the next billion-dollar thing. But Lyft, Uber, Airbnb, sort of everything you can think of, Twitter, all these followed the lead of what was first Hewlett Packard and then later Apple that kind of emerged in that fashion. All of them depended on the notion of thinking way, way, way outside the box. Stephen Jobs very famously said once in one of his presentations of what was going to be the new smartphone of, I'm about to show you something that you're going to carry around with you everywhere that you never even dreamed of before. And for good or for bad, he was right. When I went to work for a very young Google company, they were mostly looking to see what kind of corporate culture they could set, because all of these companies were so new, they had a chance to consciously look and say, what kind of corporate culture do we want to set here? And at the time, they were having trouble. They were frustrated because as I sort of point out to them, you've hired every engineer in the world who's the best and the brightest of things that frankly I didn't even understand what they were talking about at the time. I remember this was so long ago that I remember once having to say to something, what's a CD-ROM? Because it was that early. But with the Google folks, their frustration was that they weren't innovating fast enough. And I said, well, these engineers that you've hired have grew up learning how to hide every mistake they ever made. You won't see it on their resume. You won't see it in their interview with you. You won't see it on their dissertations. You won't see it anywhere. Every mistake they've ever made, they have hidden. And what you need to do is build in an incentive for them to show their mistakes and to praise them so you can move on, sort of in the vein of the Ben Franklin and the Thomas Edison milieu, where you have to have 200 no's before you can find a yes. And so that was a model that, and I certainly didn't invent it, but I amplified it with them about that as a cultural setting. And I translate that to our work with churches because we are extremely risk averse in churches. We're structurally that way. We are probably genetically that way. And it doesn't serve us in a time of deep adaptive change to hold on to that particular DNA that we have in our system. We have to learn to loosen it up. I think I'll stop there and we'll add some as we go, but that's where we sort of look at the translation period to what we're at now. As we've often said to you folks before, in a period of technical changes where you just need to tweak this or that, add a praise band, get a younger pastor, whatever the magic bullet is in your brain that you're imagining, it's going to do the magic trick at some church. Technical changes in that sort of period, that's what you're faced with. Then best practice is your friend, and you want to go out and look and say who's doing what right, that I can copy. But if it's an adaptive challenge, best practices are your worst nemesis, because you're aiming at something that has got two things wrong with it. It's what just happened to used to work. You've already gone over that curve on the bell curve, and it's not something that is tied to your contextual DNA. You're pulling it out of a hat. So those are kind of the challenges that face us when we say we need to innovate quickly.
Well, I remember, Deborah, when you were telling me about that work with Google, that one of the things you did with them was you got all those engineers, not all of them at once, in a room and gave them a problem that they could not solve. There was no solution. You forced them to fail and then talked about what that was like, and that this is exactly that's a muscle that Google needed for them to strengthen as they went forward. One of the other things about rapid fail R&D is when they had an issue, we don't know how to do this yet. We need to figure out this. What they would do is typically they would put 4 or 5 teams together to pursue the same issue, but give them a different starting point, or just let them say, you try to figure this out. And most often, at least 4 of those 5 teams would fail. They would not figure it out. And then Google would go back to them and say, okay, but what did you learn from that effort? What did you learn doesn't work anymore and we should not put any more money into? And then let's transfer those assets over to these 2 teams that still seem to be making progress on the issue. Now, one of the differences for churches is we don't have the finances and we don't have the human capital to say, okay, we don't know what Sunday school should look, or Christian formation. We don't know what Christian formation should look like anymore. We're pretty sure it's not the ages and stages, have a class for every grade level. So what is that going to look like in the future? You can't put 5 teams together to pursue that. It takes a little arm twisting to get people to be on one team to try to address that issue. So that's not the point. That's not the takeaway, I think, for churches from this model. But it is the willingness to take risks, even the risk of failure, and knowing that that's going to be the way forward, rather than, as Deborah says, looking to those best practices that would have worked really well 5 years ago. Yeah, Deborah?
Jim, I thought I'd lay out for them quickly the sort of the two theoretical methods that PneuMatrix sort of sits on that have served us well. We clearly, when we're working with churches that are facing adaptive challenges, and what church isn't, we're going in first trying to help that church figure out what its particular DNA is. We use things like Mission Insight to get the demographic look of who they are, but we look historically. We have a few exercises and games we use to tease out the story of that church's deep DNA, because it never pays to have a church try to patch in a fix that doesn't fit their actual DNA. But there are two sort of theories and methodologies that we got from the secular world that we use. The first one is called positive deviance. And I think Jim, maybe in one of his presentations, has mentioned this to you before. It's a Peace Corps process that developed out of the post-Vietnam War. And I won't give you the backstory, but to say that it's essentially says the answer is in the village, but it's where you look in the village and what voices you listen to. And so in this particular example that it was born out of in the post-Vietnam era, it was about, there's a sense of you have to go to the fringes of the village to find the answer. And that translates over theologically for us in the sense that we believe that that the answer is in our village, that the people of God have the answer. God is, through the Holy Spirit, is working in some corner or niche or nook or cranny of your family of faith with the answers. And then also theologically, the sense that every voice is important to the body of God. And so I have found examples where if we relook at who is at the table and who is not at the table, traditionally in our churches, that's an important exercise. I was working with one group in a committee that worked with me on Zoom a couple times a month, and there was an adult child of one of the members who was severely autistic, and that church was very accustomed that young man would come to every meeting, to every church. Sort of the congregation was very used to him, but he would pace back and forth and just do his thing and never said a word. And then once, when we were trying to make a critical decision about a direction and discernment of which way the church should go on a particular project that they were doing, he suddenly blurted out and scared the bejesus out of all of certainly me, and said, "What is the matter with you people? Of course this is the right way." And then he completely explained, as though he was a savant about it, exactly why that was the right choice. And well, that was a crazy sort of example of what voice had we invited to the table and what voice showed up. If any of you have read Todd Bolsinger's Canoeing the Mountains, it's the Sacagawea voice that you're looking for. It's in another group in Albany Presbytery that I worked with, it was the youth group that did an adult exercise a completely different way with a completely different set of answers about the church. And so that was a voice like, oh, we didn't really invite them to that discernment table. And so that practice is important. The second methodology that we've used that has been very productive for us is out of Silicon Valley again, and it's called a hackathon. And I usually start by saying, no, it has nothing to do with your computer being hacked. It's that all of those Airbnb and Lyft and Uber and Twitter and everything else that we were talking about, that all those logos on the buildings around me, those were all invented in the form of a hackathon, which is that sense of just getting down to it with those groups that Jim described. We're hacking away, trying to find the right sense of code for the right sense of the next best thing. In their case, they're chasing the dollars, I'll grant you, but they're chasing the new technology to bring it to you, something you didn't know was possible. When we use hackathons in the church work that we do, there's actually some neuroplasticity thinking behind it. And especially it's important for us very cerebral Presbyterians. It's to use an exercise and a methodology that gets us out of the quadrant of the brain that we're most comfortable with and get us into another. Presbyterians have a set of ordination questions, the same for the clergy and the deacons and the elders. And everybody's favorite ordination question is, will you promise to serve the church with energy, intelligence, imagination, and love? And I often say to them, the Presbyterians are pretty good at 3 of those, and we kind of suck at the 4th. And the one that we kind of suck at is the imagination one, because we're so linear and so cerebral in our DNA. And imagination is what it's going to take to get to whatever our next is. And so I equate that with the notion of the image of God at work in us, is to get us to a point in through the exercise that we use of being in a different quadrant of our brain, so that we can suspend the critic or the evaluator or the analytical or whatever. So the one rule of a hackathon is much like improv theater. It's always yes and, never yes but. So we sit down and we start spitting. This after we've learned what our DNA is. We start spitting out almost like a spitball session, if you will, of throwing out ideas. And if people trip over the word hackathon, I remember I did this to Bill Wilson in one of the groups our leadership was in. I said, just cross out the word hackathon and said crazy ass ideas that the Holy Spirit might have for working with us. And they all kind of loosen up around that. Okay. And I constantly will have at church, they'll say, I'm a little timid about this. I don't think we'll be very good at this. Maybe we'll come up with 3 or 4 ideas. And 40 minutes later, they have a list of 35 new ideas for the church. And some of them are stupid, but they are unvetted. They are, free flowing. They are, no one has sort of put a stamp on them one or the other yet. And then we have a grid by which we teach them how to vet it, that list in a later session. And truly through prayer, you see the work of the Holy Spirit emerging and rising like cream to the top for ideas.
Yeah, I was going to say about that. When I'm working with a church and I'm talking with a pastor about putting together a team of 5 to 7 people to work with me on this process, and I always talking about make it a diverse group. Make sure you get a long-time member, somebody who's very new. Make sure they're men and women. Make sure if you've got racial diversity, that you've got somebody who's racial ethnic on the team. And then I'll always say, and make sure you put someone who comes into your office about every other month and says, I have a crazy idea. I want that person on that team. And I want that person on that team specifically, for the whole process, to stretch the boundaries of what's possible in the conversation. But that person is especially helpful when we get to that point we're doing a hackathon with them. They're going to be the ones that begin to really kind of blow up the framing for the conversation and how widely people's ideas can move. And I'm also thinking about Mike Queen, who is one of our Center for Healthy Churches consultants, who was talking on one of our webinars about having a woman come into his office who they had just bought a building across the street. It became available. They didn't know what they were going to do with it, but they thought, we ought to go grab that asset. And he came in and said, I want to start prison ministry in that building. And Mike's first impulse was just kind of to shoo her off and get her out of his office. And then she told him, said, Mike, you're sitting there thinking, I can't do that. But here's something you don't know about me. And she had been in prison for a fairly short sentence, but she'd been on the inside. She knew what that life was like. She knew what issues those folks were struggling with. She was the perfect person to start that ministry. And Matt and Jeannie, you're both inheritors of that tradition, that building and those ministries are still an important part of the way that First Baptist in Wilmington brings healing and hope into the larger community. So looking for those folks who are in some ways almost not the usual leaders, but the people who are the most creative. It's always good to have at least a couple of people on any team you're putting together to say, what do we do about, let's go back to that issue I posted earlier. What do we do about Christian formation? Most everybody in the room is going to start from square one is going to be the age and stage model we've done, the way we've always done it. You need one person in there who just kind of blows that out of the water and begins the conversation from an entirely different point. Is Well, how do we always say parents are the primary Christian educators for their own children. How do we give this ministry back to them in the home? Well, that leads to a whole different kind of conversation. Deborah, you were saying earlier, and you may have said all you want to say about it, but you were talking about that churches are so risk averse. Why are we so damn risk averse, do you think?
Well, part of it is that those of us who are still in church and still active and still coming to worship in churches are there because we are nostalgically wedded to the way we've done things for a long time. And what's clearly, I mean, y'all know this, that the most important thing about change is to first acknowledge that it's a grief process. And I mean, even back when I don't do many anymore, but when I was doing weddings in the church where I was serving, you know, I talked to the couple about the sad side of getting married, the things that you're going to be putting aside and that you aren't going to be the way they were before. So even in a very happy situation, you have to understand that there's grief and loss, whatever it is. And I think dealing honestly with that with people is important. But the risk averse also is like nobody wants to waste the money of the church on something. So learning how to find incremental ways of trying risk quickly and learning things is important in that regard. I think one of the things, though, is helping to educate our people on the fact that, you know, in Phyllis Tickle's language, the rummage sale time is here in Christianity, that we are in post-Christendom. Jim has explained to you before that we were sort of birthed in, we both grew up in the South, but were birthed into our ministries in the Northwest, in Northern California, and that was already a culture that was in post-Christendom and had been for a decade or so. So, you know, as we work across the country and find other places where, Matt, I'm guessing parts of Texas are pretty sure that Christendom is still alive and well. It's a coming to grips with the reality of what's before us. Y'all, I think, have heard me use the quote from Bill Drummond, who's the urban analytics professor at Georgia Tech and also a press-trained minister, who said in the future of the PCUSA in particular, we were asking, but mainline churches in general, he said, well, probably by about the year 2040, all your churches that are 100 or fewer will be gone. Just sort of in the secularization of what's going on in Christianity in America. And that's a 2x4 that I use with the people, and said, so here's the challenge, folks. He said, actually, the quote he said was, if you do nothing different. So a lot of our ministry is saying, what is the something different that we can be doing and that we might try? To me, something of rewarding people, of understanding that if mentally they think they're not good at adapting to change and they won't take risks, the COVID situation taught us overnight that we're adaptive. You know, all of you know that within a good week or so, you had practically every church you know switching to virtual worship, because we had to. Now, we had used Zoom for a decade, so we had people out there who kind of already knew it, but constantly, you know, was saying, okay, let's take all these churches, and during Lent, for God's sake, let's get them online to do worship and play as we go. And because we improvised, improvisation was what drove us during COVID. Like we look and say, well, how do you do communion? How do you baptize? How do you marry? How do you bury? How do you do any of the? How do you welcome new members on this? And we constantly were forced into that mode of thinking completely outside our comfort zones and completely outside the box. Yeah. We have the ability to do that. We've proved it.
Yeah. Now, as you were talking, Deborah, I was remembering, one of our early engagements was with my own presbytery, then Presbytery of Sacramento, and one of the churches we worked with, and we were doing a lot of that by Zoom. I was close by, so I could go visit churches every once in a while, but Deborah did all her work by Zoom. And we had a woman from a strong suburban congregation in Metro Sacramento call me after the process was over with and said, never do this over Zoom again. Never do this virtually. You show up at the place. And I just think, okay, and in a decade now, we all have, the default is whatever we're going to do it by Zoom. We're now coming into the fall. We're trying to rethink that issue. This fall actually is a very important time, both for learning what is or isn't going to happen in your particular congregation around issues like, are people coming back? Do people want to be together? Are families with young children going to want to come to Sunday school? Especially those younger children that finally now we have vaccines for. But we're going to have some churches that say, hey, we're kind of back to normal. And we're going to have a lot of churches that say, hey, it still feels like we're in COVID. And so context is going to be everything about sort of how you carry this conversation forward. One of the things that I wanted to talk about in terms of what I think of as the willingness to do holy experimentation, and then listening for the nudges of the Spirit as you go through that process. I will often say to churches, try something. If it fails, then stop and ask, what did we learn from that failure? And how will that change the way we think about trying something new again? Because the only failure that is a bad failure is one that you don't learn anything from. And that's going to require, in most cases, because usually if we fail, then we just want to get out of the room as quickly as possible and never admit that we did that work together. But to ask a team that tried something and had it not work out to say, why do you think it didn't work out? What did you learn? What would you suggest we consider if we ever try anything like this again? That's a part of that iterative process, Deborah, you were talking about trying something, having it fail. What did we learn? Sort of trying, version 2.0, version 3.0, version 4.0 before we figure out this is a pattern, this is a model now that has some promise for the future. I was thinking about, Silicon Valley. Steve Jobs was fired from Apple. And I don't even remember what the whole fight was he got into with his board, but he left. And then after another person led the company for a while, they brought Steve back. And he talks about that was the most satisfying and productive period of his whole career, was that second act at Apple, and coming back and doing things differently because of what he had learned from the failures that led to his firing. One of the helpful ideas for me as I think about this issue is Gregory Jones, who was at Duke and then went out to Baylor, and now came back to Duke and now is the president of Belmont University in Nashville. Talks about traditioned innovation. He says, you don't have to start by creating something out of whole cloth. It's more about looking at your own particular tradition, whether you're Free Church, Baptist, Reformed, Connectional, Lutheran, hierarchical, kind of whatever that tradition is, and to say, what are some things that we can do that stay connected to the root of that tradition that is deep in our DNA, but gives us the flexibility to try new things within that tradition. And my best example of that is a church here in Sacramento. It's a United Methodist Church. It was a congregation, Central Methodist was a church that was dying on the vine. Average age of 72.2, maybe 40 members left. And the bishop said to these two younger pastors, man and a woman, not married, would you go in and see if you could do something with this site? Develop your own ministry. I want you to take care of those folks from Central who are still there, but do your own ministry. And so they created the Table, which is a progressive, affirming congregation that has grown from that original group of 50 to now over 400 in about 7 years. But here's one of the things that I think have been key to the faithfulness and the growth of that ministry is they went back to a very old Wesleyan tradition from his Sunday schools of having kitchen tables. And so every week, when you join that church, you join a kitchen table. Those kitchen tables gather for dinner once a week, and they rotate through the people's homes about where they have the dinner. But what they do is when they have had their dinner and they've caught up with each other, they enter into a time of spiritual reflection. And they start with the question of, how is it with your soul? And invite everybody who wants to respond to that question. And then they reflect together every week on the sort of Wesley's 3 commitments about Christian living. Do no harm, do all the good you can, practice the Christian traditions. They have done some amazing ministries with the homeless, with HIV folks. They have a great ministry. As a matter of fact, I'd be 30 to 40% of their congregation are people who were hurt by more conservative evangelical churches, especially GLBTQAI folks. And they have found a home and sort of regained their life and regained their faith. Because there are a lot of folks out there who have said to us, and I'm sure they've said it to you, I had to leave my church in order to preserve my faith. And so to think about how do we, within our own tradition, become a place of healing and hope for those folks and invite them to find their way back into the Christian tradition in a way that honors them as a beloved child of God and encourages their healing and a more hopeful attitude. Deborah, what are some?
I want to share a couple of examples
I was going to ask you to do that.
Of failures and successes and how they got there. And a couple of these, I don't know, there's stories I tell a lot. Jim has heard them more than he'd like to, but they have other aspects of teaching to them. So if you've heard me tell this story before, I'm going to another place with it probably. One is what I famously call the dog park church. And this is a church that's in a town, formerly rural town outside of Birmingham, Alabama. It's like a white clapboard church, the typical country church you might go to have a cute little wedding in or something. And they were dwindling down, and they only could afford 10 hours of clergy leadership a week. And they were facing that sort of, how do we draw people to us? They were still in that mentality, if we build it, they will come. And that's one of the things you have to break in us as a habit, because it's a heavy lift to ask, especially 2 lower generations of nuns and duns, as we call them, who have a very negative impression of what church is. And generally those things go together, whether they were in church and they're a dun and they left it for some reason, or they've never been to a worship service in their life. And you think, well, sure, I'll wake up on a Sunday morning too early and get up and figure out what to wear and go to this thing called worship that I've never seen before in my life. That's a heavy lift. And so we're constantly working with our churches to say, what other portals of entry are there for nuns and duns in your world, other than say, show up and we'll put on this really nice worship service. At least we think it's nice, sort of thing. And in this Birmingham church outside of Birmingham, it was suffering what many churches that used to be rural and now are on the edges of being suburban, and they're kind of struggling with that culturally. They don't like the idea that Birmingham is bleeding out that way as a cosmopolitan area, and changing them. And as we often do, they'd studied their demographics. We'd gone to the notion of, okay, you need to go talk to the people in your township, in your city, in your whatever it is that, especially small churches, they know them. They knew the mayor, they knew the council people and everything. Take them to coffee, take them to lunch, saying, we're a church that wants to reach out and really be connected to the community more. And they did in this particular church. A couple of the elders went and took the mayor of the town, whom they all knew, out to coffee. And the mayor was in a snitty mood that day, apparently, and said, I don't know what the hell you think you can do to help me. He said, my biggest damn problem right now, he was very abrupt about it, is that apparently when you're no longer a rural area and you're suburban, you have to have a dog park in your town. And he said, I don't have any money or any land for a dog park, but apparently you can't let the dogs run around anymore. And so these two elders, he was just blowing steam with them because he knew them. And the two elders looked at each other and they thought, well, wait a minute. The back acre and a half behind our church is well fenced. Maybe we could be the dog park. And they went back and told me this, as they said, crazy ass hackathon idea, Deborah, that we have. Maybe we're being called to be the dog park, for the town. And I said, okay, how are we going to integrate that with worship? And I said, and I asked, this was their thinking. And I said, have any of you here ever been to a St. Francis of Assisi blessing of the animals? And I'm sure some of you guys have either heard of it or seen it. One of them, oh yeah, when I visited the grandkids, we did it in Phoenix. I said, we're going to start with that. And you're going to do a blessing of the animals and a dedication of this space to the community. They struck a deal with the town. The town would put in the right water systems that they needed and pick up the poop containers all the time for them and stuff like that. So they had it all set up as a shared partnership. And insurance was shared and all this sort of stuff. And so they had the St. Francis of Assisi and people, to the public, bring your dog to church. And they did. Well, and it turns out they were only going to do it once, but then they introduced the dog park to them. And if the dogs got rowdy in the church, then they had someone who would look at them, just like young kids. And we walk them out of worship if they're too rowdy, but there's someone looking after them. That was the same with the dogs. And on good weather days, they'd have the coffee hour in the dog park. Well, come to find out, if you tell people they can bring their dog to church, they will come, even if they've never gone to worship before. And so they doubled their membership pretty quickly, and filled the sanctuary that was otherwise very slim looking for them. And they are now the dog park church. And the ASPCA holds all their adoptions there in the county. It's gotten known for it. They went deep, deep, deep on a really, really specific DNA issue of what does the community need? How can we address it? That's who they are. You can go on their website and see the pictures of them. At the same time, the same church, in terms of failure, I get the failure part in there. When I first started working with this church, one of the elders in the church said, we got a $16,000 bequest to the church. That is just so exciting for us. What should we do with it? And this particular elder said, I think we ought to invest in one of those big LED light signs for churches. All the really successful churches have those big LED signs. And I was trying to be polite about it and say, yeah, for a street that you live on that nobody drives on, that's a good idea, And I tried and tried and tried, and others tried with me, said, no, listen to it. And I was done, and they were excited about being the dog park church. And son of a gun, if 2 months later, one of the other elders said, Sam used that $16,000 and bought the LED sign for the church. So, you're not going to cure all ills. And who knows, maybe I was obstructing the work of the Holy Spirit, and maybe they advertised dog things on it too. I have no idea. But it was that sense of, there's still some folks that are driven by that, their sense of best practice that they're going to keep coming back to, of this is going to be the magic bullet for us. But they were an example of a group that, went deep on their DNA. Another one is in Albany, New York, where the new young female pastor, whose husband was the librarian in town, and this was her first call. They had 3 young kids young boys under the age of 6. The middle child was autistic. And she went into this group saying, I need to introduce you to my kids, and I need especially for you to get to know Ash. Ashley is autistic, and this is how you can best respond to him, how he will best relate to you whenever he's going through whatever he's going through. And so she taught them very gently and compassionately how to deal with this child that was a new PK in the scene. That led to their discussion of, we don't have a Sunday school much of anything anymore. You're coming in with 3 kids, kind of doubles our Sunday school attendance. But they said, you probably know all of the people in town that do support services for those with autistic kids? I do. And they said, oh, let's talk. What if we created a Sunday school that was designed for kids that are autistic and that was led by someone who works with autistic kids? They went and found that. They found a couple of people that wanted to teach it, said, oh, I work in this field. I would love to teach the Sunday school. I'm Methodist. I'll come into your Presbyterian church though, and I'll teach it there with you guys. And then they put the word out to families, and they had families coming in tears saying, as a family, we have never been able to comfortably worship in a church because of this situation in our lives. And that they became sort of they blossomed beyond that, and now they have not just the Sunday school and by the way, the Vacation Bible School for autistic kids and everything like that, all geared towards that community, and it's grown and grown, and as has their church. Is that they also said, well, how about other versions of neurodiversity? And they have a handbell choir that is entirely made up of Down syndrome kids. And it's crazy. But what they did is they got specific about saying, where is a need? What is a niche? How can we help? And it not only was an incredible mission that they began, but it was a blessing back to them in terms of making them a much more stable, viable, sustainable congregation.
Well, maybe as a last word, as we go into this fall, people are sort of coming back into church, hopeful that things will be better than they've been the last 2 years, a little fearful that it won't. And we need to counterbalance both of those by encouraging people to think about this season, this fall, this program year, as a time for us all to engage in some curiosity, some creativity, to being open to new things that the Spirit might be already doing among us, but we're not paying attention to them yet. And invite people to be in prayer with one another, to maybe even to encourage times for prayer and worship, about just making this a year-long season of Pentecost, where we're open to the outpouring of the Spirit on us, and to be willing to follow leads and nudges of the Spirit, even if we don't have all the information we need to know that it's going, what we're about to try is going to be a success. And knowing that iteration of trying something new, determining what its fruits are, how it's producing fruits of the Spirit, following those fruits. When it doesn't work out, bless it, give thanks for it, and say, what are we going to try next? That might be a good thing for us all to pair with our congregations, who hope, some of our congregation members are hoping desperately we're going to find ourselves back at February of 2020. And we all know that we're not. So be prayerful with you folks, encourage creativity, and invite them to become holy experimenters with the Spirit. Matt, I think that'll do us for today. Thanks for this time. It's really been good to be with you all. I want to tell you just a little bit about what we're going to be doing next week and in the webinar. Next week, we have Bethany Pierbolt, who is an associate pastor of a church up in Michigan, a Presbyterian church. She has a TikTok ministry that now has over 290,000 followers. So she's doing something right. She's hit some chord. She's building on that she's got a proposal that she's developed now to basically to create an all digital ministry. We know some churches that have moved to buildingless church kinds of models. She wants to build a congregation that only knows each other over social media, and to figure out how to be church together and how to do mission in their own communities out of that platform. So I hope you'll join us next week to hear Bethany talk about what load does she think she's. So that'll be next.